So good morning, or good noon, I suppose. My name is Ingrid Willard. I'm the new Dean of Economic and Management Sciences, and I just want to add my word of welcome to that you already received from Prof. Dupré this morning. We're really delighted that you continue to identify and have an affinity with the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at Stellenbosch University. We're very proud of the institution. We know you're very proud of the institution, and we're just delighted that you continue to walk this journey with us and continue to be ambassadors for the faculty and for the university. Of course, this has been a very big year for the university. It's our centenary year. The faculty is not quite 100 years old. We're only 93 years old, but nonetheless, we've been part of those celebrations. And it's been a remarkable thing to spend this year celebrating the successes of the 250,000 people that have journeyed through this institution over the last 100 years. It's quite something to think that in 1918, the university opened with 500 students and 40 staff. Today we have about 30,000 students and 3,000 staff. So we've roughly maintained the same staff to student ratio over the 100 years, but really upscaled in a remarkable way. And so it's been a year in which we've really looked back and thought about the role the university's played in teaching and in research, and it's prepared us now for the next phase of the university's life. So the motto of the centenary, or the theme of the centenary, was 100 years of learning, growing, and moving forward together. So as we come to the end of the centenary year, we then start to think about how do we take that next step into the future, and so that makes it particularly apt that we have Morné Mostert speaking to us today about future and thinking about Africa and our role within Africa. I'm not going to do a long introduction because that's just going to take away time from Morné, but just to say that he is the director of the Institute for Futures Research in the faculty. He plays a role in advising organizations all over the world. He was recently elected to the Club of Rome, which is an incredibly prestigious thing. And in addition to that, he sits on an advisory board at the ILO, looking at the future of work. So we're very proud to be associated with Morné Mostert, and very happy that he's speaking to us today. I should also tell you that he has a book, which I ordered this morning as a Christmas present to myself. You can do the same. So his book is called Systemic Leadership Learning, Leadership Development in an Era of Complexity. So I thought that would make some nice Christmas reading. So over to you. Thank you, Morné. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Willard, and for that plug of my book. Buy now for Christmas is really what I'd suggest. Even small children can benefit. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Wow, this is really fantastic to have this large number of people here. You really are the hardcore business scientists, aren't you? I mean, it's the 10th of December. And here you are, and you'd like nothing more than another lecture. That really is quite spectacularly impressive. I am with the Institute for Futures Research, as you've heard. We are the first and remain the only industry academic institute for futures research on the entire African continent. Just another example of where this faculty leads the way. And what I'm going to share with you is just some thoughts on Africa. Of course, it's a ridiculous topic. You can spend 5 years discussing it. I'll just share some thoughts on how perhaps we've come to think of the continent. And then I'll just invite you to think about your future in Africa. What does that look like? And what sort of decisions do you think you'll make? And of course, as many of you know, it is a legal requirement for us as futurists to use the word paradigm at least 17 times a day. You can get arrested if you don't. So there it is on the very first slide. So really the invitation here is take a walk with me as we think about how we've come to think of Africa the way we do today, and then think about what that might mean for where we're going with Africa. You happy with that? Comfortable? Okay, we have some time at the end, maybe we can take some questions. Our number is growing, just as the population of Africa is growing. This is very encouraging to see. The news must be spreading. Okay, there she is. It's anything you can say about Africa, you can say the opposite, and it's also true. Africa's rich, but poor. Africa's progressive, but slow. Africa's expanding, but contracting. It's a multiplicitous, complex, dichotomous place. Over 2,000 languages, around 54 countries, depending on who's counting. Huge percentages of the world's natural resources. Already about 1 in 6 of us on the planet is an African. And by around 2045, says UNESCO, around 1 in 4 young people on the planet will be an African. So the sheer numbers should let you sit up and pay attention, because it's moving in a very big way, in a seismic way. It really is a planetary shift. And I'll share just some thoughts of how we've come to think about it. If you're an academic here, then this slide is for you. Paradigms are really about ways in which we think. So we're going to think about how do we define Africa and its origins, how do we know what we know about Africa epistemologically, what do we value about Africa, if anything at all, do we find her, for example, aesthetically pleasing and ethically stable, and then teleologically, where would you like to go with Africa? What's your plan? Most of our work at the Institute for Futures Research is with business. More and more also with larger state-funded organizations. And the main work we do is really an advisory service. We have a postgraduate academic program, but most of the work is actually an advisory service to large organizations. And it turns out that paradigms are not just for academics. It turns out the way that we think influences the way that we make decisions. And the way that we make decisions influences where we spend the money. And where we spend the money shapes the future. So it's important stuff. But okay, enough about the academics. Paradigms are really about thinking and advancing your thinking. And one of the ways to think about thinking, gosh, that's a thing you can only say at a university, isn't it? Anywhere else in the world, get back to work. But we spend a lot of our time thinking about thinking. It's called metacognition. And as you know, in academia, it is critically essential to divide your subject area into 3 parts. Triangle is often very popular. I've gone for the 3-legged version here, as you can see. And you can think about your new thinking of Africa in terms of the content. What is it that you think about Africa in its future? The method, in what way are you going about thinking about her future, whether it's, let's say, analytically or creatively, innovatively, futuristically, or systemically. And then the level of that thinking. Is it quite a sort of operational procedure level, like looking after your own security? Or is it at, let's say, a mega futures level where you're thinking about the multiple decades ahead? So you can think about what you think, how you think, and the level at which you think about it. Let's just go back a little bit. This is something that futurists don't do a lot. We study, of course, what hasn't happened yet, but let's just go back. Sometimes that's useful. This is from Pliny the Elder, who probably stole it from Aristotle. And this is what the Romans used to say about 2,000 years ago. Semper aliquid novit, exactly. Always something new out of Africa. Always something new. And of course, at the time, it was a little bit insulting because it was the sort of fables and stories of crazy animals you'd see in Africa and so on. But it turns out 2,000 years later that this is not wrong. There is, in fact, always something new out of Africa. And that wave is growing at an almighty rate. In 1989, Pentti Malaska at the Finland Futures Research Institute, I was there just a few weeks ago, wrote a book with this title, and I was just excited about the title. Africa Beyond Famine. Not Africa in famine. Because it makes you think about what are the typical kind of big 5 that we use to think about Africa. Famine, the correlated poverty, dictatorships, civil war, malaria, and HIV, kind of big 5 of Africa. But what might Africa look like beyond that? That's what we're curious about as futurists. What might it look like beyond those kind of typical criteria? Well, let's go there for a moment. This is, about 20 kilometers from where we sit. Many of you will have seen it. The shocking thing about this is that the picture would have looked very similar if you took it 30 years ago. So the question is whether there is hope. Is it in fact possible to move Africa into a more meaningful space that doesn't resemble that? I'm pleased to tell you I suspect the seeds of that hope is already here. But one of the dilemmas is our attachment with the past. Now, this is a very sensitive area when we do work in the rest of Africa. Because the past in Africa has a particular kind of character and a particular kind of weight. For example, there was not a single country in Africa that wasn't colonized, not one. Perhaps South Sudan, because it's the world's newest country. Not one wasn't colonized. And so in a way, the past has a kind of flavor. And the leaders who came into power in the first decades after the liberation really kind of have their power base in their liberation status. In other words, irrespective of how well it's going, don't forget we liberated you. And that's one of the dilemmas with going forward and looking at the past. Because it kind of captures you in a time that's gone by. So even when we do work with government entities, for example, we hear a lot of this kind of, it looks and sounds like innovation, but it's often called a thing called back to basics. You've heard of this, back to basics program. Massive multi-billion-dollar program. Well, SAA has had about 12 of these, Eskom has had about 17, Denel has had about 9 or 11. Why don't they work? Well, there's a fundamental problem in the thinking with back to basics. The first problem is, what are the basics? As scientists, of course, we want to study this. So we sit with a client, they have a back to basics program, we've got a 2 billion rand budget. Go, that's fantastic, would you help us? Absolutely. Just one question, what are they? And then typically the boss would say, everybody knows the basics. They're the basics. And as scientists, we devise a very simple experiment to test whether this is in fact true. We simply hand out a sheet of paper to everyone in the room and we say, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, confidentially, please record the basics. And of course, there are as many views as there are toes in the room. That's the one problem. The second problem is that the basics have proven themselves to be unresilient to change. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to go back to them. They've already proven they can't stick around. The next problem is, if they were in fact the basics at the time and they were your guiding light, well, the problem is that they were perhaps the exact reason why you are now in a situation where you need a back to basics program in the first place. The next problem is, do you accept that things change? If you don't, well, I think that's naive. If you do, then it seems to be that your argument is that despite the fact that things are changing, you believe that the answer lies in the basics which we've already had. And the real kicker is that you're moving into a time that you've never seen before. Your theory seems to be the answers lie in a time that you'll never visit again. That seems to be extraordinarily unlikely. So empirically, our exposure to back to basics programs are famously unsuccessful. The difficulty is we are attached to what we think the basics are. We have an intellectual attachment to them. And that means that we're in this kind of transition all the time, somewhere between where we used to be, where we are now, and where some of us would like to go. Always in transition. That means we have to pay attention. So, we have a kind of rule of thumb as futurists. We call it 20-30-50 rule. It's a kind of rough indication of how you spend your intellectual energy at a senior level in a big organization. And our argument is you spend about 20% of your intellectual energy on the past. And typically that should consume you with the origins of things. It turns out the origins of things don't go away easily. Think about the origins of Stellenbosch University, the origins of South Africa, whenever you think that was, the origins of Africa, however you might define that, the origins of you as an entity. They seem to be around for a while. And in addition to origins, things like customs and traditions and behaviors and cultures and patterns, they don't change overnight. You've all been at these launches, the night before there's a launch, a change, announcement. There are doves and the half-naked acrobats. And the next morning, really the past is still around. So they don't change, and it's useful to pay attention to origins, customs, traditions, habits, patterns, cultures. Then 30% of your time on what's going on at the moment, just paying attention. And we do a thing called a transdisciplinary scan, which means you look far and you look wide beyond your own discipline. And you try to look at dots on the horizon, think about what's coming. And then at least 50% of your intellectual energy, if you're a senior person in a large organization, on what hasn't happened yet. What hasn't happened yet? What could happen? And what, in your view, should happen? And what should happen should be based on what could happen. Otherwise, it's just dreaming, right? Okay, so this is a difficult shift, because if you kind of try to calibrate Africa, it doesn't look like that. You look at South Africa, for example, you think about how often we discuss the past. It's not 20%, right? It's a little bit more, it's at least 22%. A bit higher, and you're a politician. So there's a bit of a shift. I was just in Finland, and what I found fascinating about that society, and of course it's different, we can't benchmark, and I understand all the theoretical dilemmas, but they have, for example, an active parliament that compels the national government to gather futures data from all the regions, at least annually. There's another act that creates the establishment of a parliamentary committee for the future. What do you think? Which is in itself, I think, a good thing. Okay, so here's an example of how we might think about the future. This is I've chosen education, as you can see here. This is Jean-Marc Gaultier. This is in the 1900s in France. They had a competition, draw a picture of what you think education might look like. I found this really fascinating, because I think if you left Earth 100 years ago, and you came back today, one of the only things you'll recognize is education. There's a guy in the front, and then there are people sitting at a desk. He's observed. He's tired of teaching, of course. It's the end of the year. And he's just kind of milling the stuff into their brains. It turns out this is not so far away from Elon Musk's idea of a mesh implant in the base of your brain. You don't have to remember anything any longer. But why this is interesting is it makes us think about how we think about the future, and as we say, the future is not what it used to be. So one of the questions we could ask is, what exactly does Africa have to offer? If that's Africa, that's the rest of the world. It seems it's always just so close you can almost smell it. But it's not, it hasn't quite delivered. We're not quite there yet. So I thought it might be interesting to take a little bit of a journey to the origins of the intellectual tradition in Africa. And I have to say, I'm quite disturbed that we don't discuss this a little bit more frequently. Here's just one example, many of you will know this. This is 300 BC, this was down at Alexandria, a research institute with lecture halls like this one, Archimedes, Euclid with students there, Aristarchus and so on. Kind of a rich intellectual tradition, an exchange of ideas. You might say, oh well, one swallow does not a summer make. Let's move on about 300 years ago to Axum, the modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. The short version of this slide is that Axum was like the Manhattan of its day. A central hub for trade, welcoming of all kinds of religions and ideas and philosophies. And by the way, that's a really interesting global trend. The commerce, which is one of the things I love about our faculty here, the traders have been some of the most internationally exposed people on the planet, because you trade with the rest of the world, right? So traders, whether it's in Dubai or any trade port, South Africa at one point, were really quite warmly embracing of the rest of the world. Different languages, different traditions. This was Axum in around 270 AD. Let's move ahead about another century or so when we have this guy, Augustine of Hippo, who wrote about something that you see on CNN every day today. He wrote about rational beings possessing free will. Can we choose? And he wrote about just war. What is a just war? Is war in Afghanistan a just war? The war in Syria and so on. Let's move ahead just a few centuries more, and we have the kingdom of Mapungubwe to the north here. Uncle Bob's former turf. A post-colonial state, well, it's interesting that, of course, this is a pre-colonial state, a really vibrant society, one of the great cities of the world in its time, and again a place of trade, relevant to our faculty here. But let's think about where the formal institutions were established. Well, this is Zaytouna in Tunisia. I was there a few months ago, considered by UNESCO to be the world's first university in Africa, the world's first university. Not Bologna. Bologna is the world's first Western university. This is the world's first university. Here from Africa. Perhaps you thought this is an aberration. Well, about 100 years ago, Africa's second and the world's second university, Al Qarawiyyin in Morocco. The third university in the world, again an African university. This is Al-Azhar University in Cairo. It would be another century until Western Europe would have its first university. By the way, shortly after that, of course, the famous University of Timbuktu. Timbuktu, as some of our international students like to call it, in the 12th century. So this enormous wealth of an intellectual tradition in the history of Africa, which I found really, really fascinating and intriguing. It would be about another millennium until we had the next university, Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone, in 1827. And then, as all stories go, there's a when suddenly. Well, when suddenly, about 30 years later in Berlin, we have the Berlin Conference. And the Berlin Conference would change the trajectory of the continent forever. And essentially what happened is that a group of Europeans came together with a rough draft of Africa and some pens and thought, okay, you take this piece, we'll take that piece. As if it was their own pizza to divide up amongst themselves, with no understanding of the natural migration of animals, the tribes, the languages, the traditions. Just imagine being at that meeting, thinking that because you can draw a map, you can somehow pick a part for yourself. And of course, this would change forever what the continent might look like, and be the foundation for civil war to come for decades, as it created fragmentation far and wide. And then, in 1963, African leaders said, wait a second, I think it's our time now. 1963, we have the Organization for African Unity, and so today, the Institute for Futures Research, which just recently launched an African Futures Program, we celebrate Africa Day to celebrate the idea that Africa is thinking about her own future. Of course, we know this changed into the AU in May 2000. But let's just look at some popular culture and think about how that may have shaped your view. Some of you will remember this. Toto, Africa, they're blessing the rains down in Africa. My main objection is that we're not down anywhere. There's no up or down on the planet, it's a random view, we're in space. So I think that's a thinking error to start off with. But what I'd really like is for someone in Africa to create a song like I Bless the Sunshine Up in Europe. That'd be an interesting paradigmatic flip. Anyway, this becomes one of the great songs about a place no one's ever been, including this band. And it starts to shape what is this mysterious place. Again, it kind of reawakens in the popular mind. And in the next year, Bob Geldof thinks, wait a second, I have an interesting research question. Do they know it's Christmas? We do. But he wasn't sure. And of course, this was done in response to the famine from Ethiopia. And that photograph, I think, shaped how many people around the world think about what it's like in Africa. We still get students, international students, on a regular basis, who wonder about where that photograph was taken. So, this is Bob Geldof. Do we know it's Christmas? They want to feed the world. It's not a feed lot, but okay. I suppose it was a useful kind of idea. And then, shortly afterwards, we had Live Aid. Live Aid. This generated at least £150 million, at least a half of which went directly to militant groups, because the funding mechanisms were really primitive. But I suppose it was about lending a hand. Let's move forward a little bit in the popular mind, and we have the mid-80s now, Out of Africa. I always thought it should be called Into Africa. Isn't that the whole thing about the movie? She comes to Africa. Of course, she's wearing the pith helmet, not in this photograph. She wears the pith helmet, symbol of colonialism. She's married, or so we think, but of course he's a philanderer. Feminism is just emerging. She makes her way in Africa, and the natives will help her to do so. They're at her service. Okay, and it does extremely well on the Academy Awards. Mozart did the background music. It worked very well for the rest of the world. But it turns out Bob Geldof was famously unsuccessful because Time magazine wonders, why are Ethiopians starving again? There's Time magazine. Why are they starving again? Why is this so intractable? Why is this not going away? And then in 1994, the world started thinking about Africa like this a little bit. It's a cartoon. There's a lion. He's the king of the jungle, despite the fact that the jungle makes him a very small part of Africa. But okay, he stands over there, and this creates the image in the rest of the world that all of us are just walking along the streets with our pet lions, singing Hakuna Matata, not a care in the world. Off we go. I was really surprised as I moved across Africa, and I've worked in at least 11 African countries, about how offended some people were with this. How it caricatured so much of what Africa is about. Of course, it's done nothing for conservation, because if they're cartoon characters, then they're really not real. Okay, let's move ahead a little bit. It gets more serious now. Black Hawk Down, this is in Somalia, because we all know they're all fighting there down in Africa while they're blessing the rains. There's Black Hawk Down, the United States. It's a story of the United States hero comes to Africa to rescue the place. Of course, it goes horribly wrong. But also, it won 2 Academy Awards for Best Film Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and so on. Black Hawk Down in Somalia. Well, Somalia is a serious problem. I mean, that's the dilemma with Africa. It's kind of true. It's partly true. Then, here on our own shores, we had this in 2006, Tsotsi, based on the novel by Athol Fugard. International students are really quite surprised when we tell them that Athol Fugard is the world's most performed playwright after Shakespeare. An old South African guy. And of course it's Tsotsi, and I'm sure you all know Tsotsi is a gangster, so it's a black guy who's a gangster, right? What else could he be? There was the cartoon character option, but the gangster theme seems to stick well. When I lived in London, I did a project for the Black Media Institute, and we were looking for an image of a healthy black relationship in the media. It's a bizarre experience. White guy from South Africa goes to the UK, works in a place where I'm the only white person. It's really bizarre. And we were trying to look for this black role model, if you like, and it was really, really difficult to find. The Cosby Show was the only one at the time. So, yeah, let's not talk about that. So Tsotsi does really well, but the problem is, it kind of perpetuates the storyline, right? It's a black guy, so he's a thug. Of course, it turns out he has emotions in the end. Wow, what a cliffhanger that was. Okay. Then, more recently, we had this, the Black Panther. And I put these things up deliberately, by the way, because a lot of my colleagues seem to discuss these things. It has meaning for them. And this one had a particular impact on so many of our colleagues. I was doing a keynote a few months ago in Kenya. And there was a big discussion about Black Panther and what that means for black identity. And, you know, the impact this has had and the ripple effects all over the world. And it turns out to be the top-grossing superhero film of all time. And the media interest, of course, was that there was all sorts of black people in it. So, still, when I travel to Europe, as I'm sure many of you do, people are surprised that, you know, you can have this colour skin and come from here. But this was a really interesting one, and I don't claim to understand it, but it seemed to have had a massive impact on the way that a lot of people think about their own identity. the idea that Africa can be a technologically advanced place. We did send a note to Trump just to let him know that he should not appoint an ambassador to Wakanda. It's not a real place. Okay, let's go to that Bible of our study field, The Economist. What do they have to say about the subject? Well, in May 2000, they had this view: the hopeless continent. It's a young man, teenage soldier, and he's carrying an RPG. My son told me that's what it was. I didn't know. I thought it was just a big gun. So the idea is, of course, there's Africa. There's only one story to tell. It's hopeless. Leave now. And I did. Yeah, sorry, this is what happens when you spend too much time on the aeroplane. Some people find that offensive too, but you can't please everyone. Okay, then this was in 2000. In 2011, The Economist felt this was what was going on. Africa rising. This is a major change in the narrative, right? You can see this is kind of poetry for economists. There's a bit of imagery there. Black guy with a big gun, and then a little boy, a little hint of the demographic shift happening in Africa, and he's got a kite sort of rising. Not the most perfect poetry, but we are dealing with business people here, just bear that in mind. Okay, so now Africa's rising. So something amazing must have happened. It was the hopeless continent, and then a decade later, Africa's rising. That's December 2011. And then in a remarkable show of a lack of creativity, less than a year later, Time magazine had exactly the same title. Africa's rising. You can see this is iconography for accountants. They've got the map of Africa there in the tree. And you can see it's urbanizing now. Are you following the story? There, just run for your life. Now there's the dust of Africa, the land of dust, but its demography is expanding, the demographic trends are expanding, and now we've got a little bit of conflict coming there between the nature and the urbanization. Turns out this is one of the great trends, of course, in Africa. By around 2050, the total current population, which is about 1.2 billion, will be the total urban population alone. The total population will be about double what it is now, about 2.5 billion people. Okay, let's move ahead a few months. Now The Economist thinks that there's aspiring Africa. So this, as you will know, is a reference to the growing middle class. The middle classes are aspiring to middle class interests, toothpaste and stuff like that. Business gets very excited in the FMCG space. Data and so on explodes. And of course they use the African imagery of the giraffe, sometimes called the Mbulamiti. It's a kind of a reference for futurists in Africa, the Mbulamiti, because the thing you can see a little bit further. Okay. So now it's aspiring. The people of Africa want more. They want more. And the dictators are getting nervous. How are we going to get this to them? Then in April 2016, about 2 years later, this really is a fantastic publication, Making Africa Work. So this is the pragmatist view, right? Enough with the philosophy of Africa and its aspiring and so on. So are you following the journey here? Run for your life. Ooh, how lovely. It's rising. It's looking ahead, so are its middle classes. Now how do we make it work? And I think that's a great question. How do we make it work? Which problem would you rather have? The Uzi problem or the following problem? Africa's fragile democracies. I thought that was a little bit hypercritical, don't you? If you can move in 16 years from a teenager who's going to shoot you with an RPG to we're debating our democracies, which problem would you rather have? I'd rather debate the quality of the democracy. So I suppose part of my thesis is the ground has shifted under our feet. I don't know if we're celebrating that enough. So our democracies were a bit fragile. So we're improving them. That's not a bad problem to have. That's August 2016. And then, just after that, The Economist published this image. to show the true scale of Africa. And of course, many people took offense. It's very difficult not to get people who take offense, because they felt that this was a kind of a new colonialist map with China and the United States. And that was really not the idea. The idea is simply to show the scale of the place. You know, the scale of the place. But of course, not everyone got it. One guy who didn't get it was our previous president. Mr. Can't read a large number on TV himself. And he looked at the map and then proudly announced that they found that the whole world can now fit into Africa. Even my 10-year-old said, well, where would Africa go then? But it turns out it's a big place. That's the point of the slide, right? You think China's big and the United States is big and India is big and Eastern Europe is big and so on and so on, some Western European countries. There's a lot here. There's a lot here. Let's go to the Orange Messiah across the pond there. He, not the world's most informed Africanist, praised the healthcare system of this place, Nambia. Very proud of what they were doing there in Nambia. I haven't travelled everywhere, but okay. And then someone from Nambia produced this map to show where exactly Nambia is and also where some of the other countries in Africa might be. You can see there's Tanzania, Ethiopia, Sue and Dan are over there, and so on. Okay, I showed this at a conference and again people were very offended. I seem to be particularly unskilled at not doing that. But of course it was just to illustrate the vast, vast ignorance of the rest of the world about Africa. And I wondered whether that was really true. And it turns out if you don't know what you're talking about, don't let that stop you. So the Trumpster used this phrase when referring to Africa. And it then says in The Independent that Trump went on a charm offensive. I mean, this is something I haven't seen. Offensive, yes. Charm offensive, I don't know. Just to refer to an entire continent in these terms, I think it's really quite staggering. By the way, Buhari from Nigeria, which has, by the way, now just about 200 million people. If you've ever been to Lagos, you'll know most of them live in one street. Traffic's a nightmare. But Buhari had a fantastic response to this. And he said, okay, listen, that's fine. You're just ignorant. And then David Cameron was having tea with the Queen, as one does at a cocktail party. We're having cocktails with the Queen. I don't know if she has cocktails. And you'd think if you're David Cameron and you're having cocktails with the Queen, you're going to watch your P's and Q's, but of course, not to be. And David Cameron referred to much of Africa as being fantastically corrupt. And then Buhari said an amazing thing. He said, Dave, we forgive you. It's no problem. Just give back the stuff you took. Just give back the stuff and we're cool. We're friends. I mean, this is an extraordinary phenomenon by the UK that in the British Museum, basically what they've done is they've gone around the world, stolen stuff, and then had an exhibition on it. I think if you're going to steal stuff, exhibition is not the first thing I'm going to go with. Okay, so David Cameron said we're all corrupt, and then I wasn't pleased, and the Business Day quoted me, or published a piece, where I tried to argue that Africa does not just have one tale to tell, just like everybody else. We have a multitudinous spectrum of exciting tales to tell. And if you want to follow up on this idea, there's a great YouTube clip by Chimamanda Adichie, Nigerian novelist, called The Risk of a Single Story, where she expands upon how we think about Africa in a caricature-like way, and Africa really has a single story for most of us. My thanks to the Business Day. And then, more recently, we had this intellectual giant, who never qualified to study here, in my humble view. She's the Trumpster's sidekick. And she came to Africa, and what does she wear? I know, you can't write this stuff. She wears the pith helmet. You might as well tattoo "I'm a colonialist" on your forehead. And then, there's a big debate about, was this accidental? Now, I don't know what her cupboard looks like, but I know you accidentally just wake up in the morning and go, "Come on guys, we've got to leave, where's my pith helmet?" Very carefully choreographed. Of course, she comes out of the fashion world. And this was, of course, I think, defensively, deeply offensive to so many people. In the perfect white, with the colonialist pith helmet, the iconography spread across the continent, like many of the diseases. And it's the perfect white, so I won't touch the dust of Africa and all the rest of it. Okay, and then November 27, first of all, how am I doing for recency there? That's not bad. That's not bad. That's a few weeks ago. Come on, that's like a few days ago. The French president Macron says, "Okay, we're going to give back some of the art we stole. We admit it. We were there, and we're going to give back 26 pieces of the over 90,000 that we stole. We're just going through it at the moment to see where the valuable ones are. We'll get back to you. Don't call us." But it's a good sign, right? It's a good sign. And then I thought, is it just in the popular media or not? And then I went to Stanford University and I saw this: ethnicity and socio-political change in Africa and other developing countries. Some of you who've flown on some big international carriers, as I have, will have heard the announcement. We're proud to announce that we now fly to China, India, Africa, and other countries. We're not a country, of course. The entire continent seems to escape many of the gaze. Okay, but what's happening economically is in the early 1980s, Africa started to form these kind of economic regions. So you can see it was kind of chopped up in the Berlin conference, and now we're putting it back together again. It's a kind of Humpty Dumpty thing we're trying to do here. Can we put this thing back together again? And these economic regions are growing together very, very rapidly. In fact, in East Africa, one of my staff members has an East Africa passport and travel across East Africa with some freedom. And I think this is going to be a game changer in the future of Africa. And then to consolidate this idea, just a few months ago in Kigali, we had the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and 44 countries came together and said, maybe it's time. Did you know that the total intra-Africa trade is only about 16% of the total African GDP? Total intra-African trade is about 16% of the total African GDP. Part of that is because of this story I've been telling you, that the colonial trade routes are so well established and new ones really haven't been created. But this, I think, is a game changer. This is a complete game changer for the future of Africa. And it won't stop there, because India then responded. India, another 1.2 billion people. So between India, China, and Africa, of course, you've got half the world's population almost. India plans 18 new African embassies, which I think is just the most staggering idea. So look out for India-Africa relations. They're not going to let the Chinese take everything. There will be an interesting contestation. In the last 2 minutes or so, the story of Africa's demographics is really a fascinating one, because we have a young population, and that means that we have this potential for something called the African demographic dividend. That's essentially the ratio of those of working age over those of non-working age. And in Africa, this is looking immensely promising. And in fact, if you look at the longer-term trajectory, you can see the red there is sub-Saharan Africa. That's going to run until around 2060, the mid-2060s. You're going to have an expansion of the population of working age over those of non-working age. And that means a higher potentially productive population. Of course, you need to put a few things in place to leverage from that dividend. but it is, at least in principle, extremely exciting. This is buoyed by the fact that you have rapid urbanization, a rapid growth in literacy rates, and a rapid stabilization of economic and political conditions right across Africa. Here's another significant trend to watch out for. This is the GSMA Sub-Saharan Africa indication of tech hubs active around Africa. The story you should take from this slide is, if you're a dictator sitting in this room, I don't know how many of you voted, they are coming for you. Your days are numbered. The youth have given up waiting for the government. They're doing their own thing. And I think this is enormously exciting in the prospects for Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I've just about made it in time. I think the ground in Africa is shifting. The possibilities are absolutely expanding. We can see the global community paying more and more close attention to what's happening here. Of course, Stellenbosch University is rapidly becoming the leading research-intensive African university. And I'll leave you with the thoughts of the Hollywood comedian George Burns, who said, "I look to the future because that's where I'm going to spend rather a large part of the rest of my life." You've been very kind, thank you.
Thank you, Morné. We've got a couple of minutes. Do you want to take one or two questions?
Sure.
Any burning questions?
That's it.
I know I had. Oh, there we go.
Oh, there we are.
You're saved, because my question was really hard.
Okay, thank you for a very informative presentation. Your use of the Economist and Time magazine figures now the question with me. Are our South African journalists, and I'm thinking about Media 24 in particular, can we say that they are just as maybe positive about Africa's future? Do they have journalists that are really, I mean, I'm not thinking who are they, but are really pushing the agenda for Africa? I don't know whether you apply your mind to that.
I think that the first thing to say as a strategist is that optimism is a two-edged sword. It is, in one sense, a form of intellectual bias. Because, of course, you want to be real, not optimistic. But we also know that no entrepreneurial activity happens without someone thinking they can do it. So we can also wonder about whether it is the job of the media to do this work. I like to posit to you that I think it's partially the work of universities to do this work. And that I think you can expect a lot more work in this area in the next few decades. Certainly my expectation from the media is not to be positive. It's also not to be negative. It's to report. The work of a university, I think, is to study and to create the new knowledge necessary for the new society. I think it should be here.
I think there was another.
I was just thinking that very last slide on the tech hubs. There are some, I work for a company who also do business in Africa. There are some names there that's missing,
Yes.
which are really countries that promise huge promise for the future. Angola is one, for instance.
Yes.
What is going on there? What about these missing ones?
Yes, that's right. That, all data is, of course, propaganda, and that slide is no different. But the truth is that to gather data in Africa has been famously difficult. And in our field, which is about data of the future, kind of a strange idea for some people, it's been even more difficult to detect. What I think we're missing, and I think this answers some of your questions, is that I don't think we have, for example, very good viability indicators for nations in Africa. We're working on some of that. So, let's imagine you could have a kind of a potential, an index of potential. There are all sorts of indices, and we try and look at a large number of them. But it would be really interesting I mean, if you think about how Amazon is valued, it'd be really interesting to kind of use similar models to value some African nations. But I think some of that work is starting, but I think you're right. The picture is fragmented, it's disjointed, but the work is starting. I think that's the promising thing. You're right, it's incomplete. One more at the back.
I'd just like to get your thoughts. You said it's a game changer, the whole African coming together, talks of one currency being. How is the mind shift going to have to happen? Because in looking 20% on historic events and political leaders, they are reluctant to give away their power.
Yes.
So
Yes.
What's your thoughts on getting them to change their mind shifts, sharing power, sharing economy, and sharing value between all of that?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. I think one of the things that struck me about that free trade area agreement is that Africa's two biggest economies decided to play a wait and see game, and that's Nigeria and South Africa. And then I found that really interesting because I think there's been a lot of dialogue coming out of Nigeria and South Africa for a one Africa for a long time. I think it was really political points. Now that it's here, the question is, what are we going to lose? It reminds me of that one definition of a communist, which is that it is someone who has nothing and is willing to share it with everyone. That, I think, is one of the fears that a lot of the bigger economies have. But I will say this. In some of the demographic trends, some of the indications are that the average age, complete average age on the continent, subject to serious data accuracy challenges, the average age is around 20, and the average age of leaders is over 65. So if you just look at that, and you think about what could happen in the next decade, I think you're going to have a sudden tumbling of a lot of dictatorships, and I think that will in fact open the doors. So I don't think this is going to happen next year, but I think it's going to rapidly ramp up in the next decade or so.
Well, thank you, Morné. Thank you for a really thought-provoking talk that covered an incredibly wide range, yet you managed to have very nuanced insights there. So we're incredibly grateful to you. We have a small gift for you. It looks rather magnificent, I have to say. But thank you so much.
Thanks.